Welcome back, everybody. Time again for Word Balloon, the comic book conversation show. John Suntress here. I continue my conversation with the great Denny O'Neil. This took place in the summer of 2018. This past weekend was Denny's birthday. And, man, I'll tell you, I really lucked out having several conversations over the years with Denny, especially many in 2018. He released his autobiography that year as well. And semi-autobiography, I should say. It's semi-fictional, semi-autobiographical. We talked about that a bit in a previous conversation. But you're going to hear how Denny got the Batman job. Why did he go to Marvel when he did? How did he come back to DC? The change of hands behind the scenes at DC from Carmine Infantino to Jeanette Kahn. And a whole lot more. A really wonderful conversation that I had with Denny, and I'm really happy to share it with you today. This is part 2 of the comic book universe through the eyes of Denny O'Neil on today's Word Balloon. Word Balloon is brought to you by AlexRossArt.com. Alex is a good friend of the show, and I am honored that he aligns himself with Word Balloon, and good Lord, we all love his iconic art. Whether it's for DC, Marvel, things like Monty Python, the Monkees, David Bowie, so many other great licensed things, the Beatles. If you go to AlexRossArt.com, you will find great value for your dollar, whether you can spring for something like original cover art or pages to lithos and posters, every price point you can imagine, you will find something and a beautiful image from AlexRossArt.com. Word Balloon is also presented by my listeners, the League of Word Balloon listeners. The help that I get via contributions from Patreon, patreon.com/wordballoon. You hear the entertainment that I provide from Word Balloon every day, that I do a new episode. I am very fortunate to have the great creators of comics and pop culture willing to come on and give you great entertainment. I hope you will consider making an actual cash contribution via Patreon, even $1 a month. But really, if Word Balloon is worth the price of a comic book a month to you, it would be greatly appreciated if you slide that extra money you would put on an issue of a comic book to Word Balloon via Patreon. Patreon.com/wordballoon. Thank you, League of Word Balloon listeners. I did want to ask you how you initially got the Batman writing job. And I don't know if we've ever talked about that. And I'm sure you've told the story a million times, but if you don't mind, I'd love to hear it.
No, I don't mind. I was working for Smile and Stanley as an editorial assistant, and then he fired me on what was probably the worst day of my life. I had a small baby, a child who was still being breastfed, and no money, and it was in the middle of a newspaper strike where my saleable skills were good on the market. And New York City, we didn't have any relatives, we didn't have any support system, and I didn't have any savings, and suddenly 10 o'clock of a weekday morning, I'm without a job. So I had socialized in the comic book world by then, and Steve States knew about Charlton Comics.
Yes.
And Dick Giordano came in once a week and sat in an office on Fifth Avenue that they rented. Empty room, really, with a desk and a couple of chairs, and he talked to the local freelancers. So I went up and I saw him on one of those days, and he gave me a job that I did pretty well. And then I did my first socially conscious story for him. It was called Children of Doom, and it was a pacifist-oriented story.
Jim Aparo drew that, am I right?
No, it was...
I thought he did.
It was a strange... I can't think of the guy's name. His day job was a cop.
Oh, Joe... Or no, Pete Morrissey.
Pete Morrissey, yeah, it was a hurry up job. It had to be done in 4 days.
Oh man, I love.
So and Dick called me. He had something scheduled for that, and the rights to what they were going to publish fell through. I don't have any particulars, but he suddenly had a big hole in his schedule, and he needed something in a week, and it didn't make any difference what it was. So he called me and said, can you have me a script by Thursday? And I said, yeah, I guess. So I wrote that because it's what I wanted to write. And it went to artists who were also under terrible time pressure, but I think that worked for the work they did. I think the story came off well, because nobody had time to have any second thoughts about anything. There is something to be said for deadlines, and that's part of it right there. You don't have time to, stick your head up your ass and worry about things.
Agreed. Well, and I got to, for a second, as a tangent, I am fascinated by Pete Morrissey's work, both as a writer and an artist, because he was cranking out, it seemed like 75% of Charlton's output. And like you said, by day he was a cop, and by night he was writing these stories and drawing these stories. And I love Peter Cannon Thunderbolt, and I want to say Vengeance Squad was one of his throwaway Charlton things that, managed to, they cranked out maybe 6 issues. And just the whole, God, we could spend 2 hours just talking about Charlton and the powers that be in Derby, Connecticut, and why the comics were made and what their main business was, but that we'll do that another day. But so go on. So you're doing this sci-fi story for Charlton. So then for Dick,
and I'm doing a lot of stuff for Dick, and I was a model of reliability. I did not blow a deadline. Much later, Dick and I socially talked about that, and I was always afraid if I blow this deadline, I will never get another job from this editor, and maybe not from this genre. And Dick said he had the same problem. He was afraid to miss deadlines, so he never did. He got up at 5, worked till 8, and then took a train in to be a editor-in-chief. Anyway, after about a year of that, I walked in there one day and Dick said, how would you like to do exactly what you're doing now at 3 times the money? Okay, that was a very persuasive argument for a guy who had, at that time, Larry was maybe a year and a half old, and we were living in a ghetto, and Ann did not have saleable skills. She was a philosophy major. I'm very proud of her now because she's become an environmental activist.
Oh, wow.
But at the time, sure. And what had happened was Dick had been hired by DC, and part of the deal was he could bring some of his Charlton people with him. One of those was Steve Ditko. Skates and myself were the 2 writers. And suddenly I was getting $12 a page instead of $4 a page. Years and years later, I got the whole story that I didn't know at the time, and thank God. But I was writing a text piece for Superman's 50th anniversary for a hardcover publisher in the Midwest. And one of the people I interviewed was Paul Levitz, who told me how I came to work for DC Comics. I don't know what Steve was thinking about, and I haven't seen him in years. But I was thinking, well, these people at DC saw the great work that we're doing for Charlton and decided that they would bring us aboard. No, that wasn't even close to what happened. What happened was the guys who created comic books, Gary Robinson was one of them, and, that bunch of names that you occasionally saw in the comics. It was after the war. Most of them had been veterans. They were solid citizens. They had families. They had mortgages. They were eminently decent citizens, and they asked the company for a little help with health insurance. They weren't threatening job actions or anything, just hat in hand kind, can we please have some help with this? The company's response was to fire them.
Wow.
All.
Yeah.
And Skates and I were warm bodies. We could type. That's all they knew about or cared about. So when Paul told me that story, I said, "You realize I'm interviewing you in a role as a journalist, and you just told me something that makes this company look really bad." And he said, "No, put it in print because it'll tell everybody how far we've come."
Wow.
Well, we've come much further than that since I wrote that piece. But I came to work for DC not because of any virtue I had as either a professional or as a writer, because I needed warm bodies.
Wow.
It was as simple as that.
Jeez. And I know
That was the comic book business then, and to some degree that was the TV business. Writers were going to get screwed.
Yeah. Jeez. Yeah, and
and we never did what TV and movie people did, was put together a really good union. I still get mailings from them, and I've been a member emeritus for about 10 years. But anytime anything of mine is shown at 3 a.m. in Addis Ababa, they will see that I get whatever money is coming.
That's great, man. No, I understand the Writers Guild, and certainly about 10 years ago when the idea of Netflix and streaming TV was just getting started, and even the DVD re-releases of television and film, I'm glad the Writers Guild was able to step up and, get better compensation. I don't know if, as usual with a union and bosses compromise, nobody gets everything they really want. But I'm assuming that it's gotten better, and certainly, well, yeah, you know better, I think.
Well, Roy and Jerry have a story to tell, which pretty much illustrates what you've been saying. They wrote the last Conan movie, and they took it in, and they pitched their story to Dino De Laurentiis, and he allowed us how, yeah, that was a good Conan story. They would get the job. What he did was give it to a writer he had under contract. That guy did the actual shooting script using Jerry and Roy's story, and Jerry and Roy got nothing.
Wow.
And the other guy's name went on. That was very common. It was even done in comic books. In the Superman office, I didn't have any first-hand experience with it, but you heard stories. And that editor was Jim Shooter's mentor, which I find interesting. But
was that more Weisinger? Forgive me for putting a name on it.
Yeah, I would rather not use proper names, but yeah.
Okay, all right. I understand.
And he wasn't the only one. There was one guy who, at Christmas time, gave to all of his freelancers copies of his suit and shirt and shoe and necktie preferences. So the idea was, you're going to give me an expensive Christmas gift.
Wow. Oh, my God.
Whatever Jim Shooter's problems were with him, it was exactly the opposite. He gave us nice gifts.
Well, that's good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Now, we mentioned a couple names, and actually, while we're talking about him, when you went to Marvel, what was the impetus for you leaving DC and going to Marvel?
I was writing a book on the history of comics for Scholastic Press, and I interviewed everybody I could think of to interview. One of them was Jim Shooter, who was brand new at that job. And he offered me, a job. Now, at that point, I was writing a lot, and I thought I was up to my capacity. I couldn't do any more without compromising the work. I don't know if that was true or not. We'll never know. But I was looking for some way to earn a living that did not depend on talent, but on, thinking about things. Obviously, editorial work was that. I went to my bosses at DC and presented them with the problem. I got a kid who's starting school. I have expenses I didn't used to have. Their answer was to give me more writing work. Jim Shooter's answer was to give me a writer-editor deal and a raise. So, of course, with apologies to DC, I took the offer. And for 2 years, he was the best boss I ever had. And I also had as an assistant Mark Grunwald.
Oh, wow. Sure.
Who was an enormous benefit to the comic book world.
Amen. Absolutely, man. Great writer. Absolutely.
He's gone 20 years now.
Wow.
Hard to believe.
I know. Jeez, man. Oof. So, you said, all right, so were you only at Marvel for those 2 years, or did things change? Did Jim leave and then you had other...
No, I stayed. I think I worked as a Marvel editor for 7 years.
Okay, yeah, that makes more sense.
Toward the end, though, things were getting very uncomfortable, and I sensed that Shooter was not happy with me, and I didn't know why. The frustrating part was the thing I worked at hardest was figuring out ways to please him. So I would occasionally go to his office after hours, and I'd say, I think you're unhappy with me. What can I do? Finally, Dick made his offer, and I kept stalling him. And then finally, I decided I'd be a fool not to accept Shooter's job. So I remember I went out running through Lower Manhattan that day. I was trying to run about 5 miles a day at the time. And I got back and there was a phone call. Anyway, I was hired by Shooter, who said that There Is No Hope in Crime Alley was one of the best comic book stories, and it was one of his favorites, and I was the writer. And after a year of writing Spider-Man, I got fired off that. I took over Iron Man. This is another thing I learned years later. Jim did not like my Iron Man.
Interesting.
It was getting praise from the world, but not from him, and he tried to get Mark to fire me. And Mark stood up for me and put his own job in jeopardy once a month by refusing to do that.
Wow.
And refusing to edit the stories to make them more what other people thought they ought to be. I did not have a whisper of any of that until Mike Carlin told me years later. He was Mark's assistant at the time.
Okay.
I got to know Mark really well after that, but he was he was a creative guy's editor. And eventually I kept getting calls from Dick Giordano saying, "Why, have you decided to come to work for me yet?" And I was having a tough time with Jim, so I went to his boss and said, "I've been offered a job at DC, and right now I'm thinking of taking it. Would you like to react to that?" And he said, "Is the problem your boss?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Okay, you and I and he will have," this was a Monday, "lunch on Thursday. I will make peace between you guys because we don't want to lose you." So Tuesday we had a day-long editorial conference. Wednesday I went into work and Shooter walked into my office at 10 and said, "We have to part company." He was firing me. I said, "Okay, what reason are you going to give the world for this action you're taking? He said, well, we asked Vern to change something, and it was Jim's idea, not mine, and I didn't take credit or blame for it. And in Jim's opinion, I should have. So I said, yeah, that's true. I didn't agree with the change, and I didn't tell John that it was mine. So I took leave, and then I called Dick and said, I'm ready to go to work for him. He said, well, you waited too long. We hired somebody else.
Jesus.
So for 3 weeks, I was freelance.
Oh, my God.
That was my goal that they hired.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And then right after New Year's, right after the holidays, I got a call from Dick saying, you start work on Monday afternoon, be here by 12, and welcome aboard.
Wow. Honestly, man, hearing these things, it's amazing. And again, I was reading the fan magazines back then, Amazing Heroes and Comics Interview and Comics Journal and everything. And yeah, those were our news sources. When you were doing your interviews for Scholastic, I'm curious, this opens a new question. Did you tape record them? Did you, I mean, obviously I know you're a journalist and I'm sure you're used to just doing an interview with a notepad, but how did you transcribe these interviews?
Oh, I was very conscientious, so I did tape record everything. I mean, the best job I had at that period as a magazine writer was interviewing Alfred Bester.
Wow.
It was the best afternoon I ever had working.
Yeah.
He was at a party. I was kind of social back then, and there was a party in Greenwich Village, and I was a kind of village guy, so I went, and that was Alfred Bester standing across the room. I can't go talk to him. He is a god. He is my favorite science fiction writer, so I didn't talk to him, but Roy gave me an assignment to interview him for their black and white SF magazine a week later. And he was living on like 60th and Madison. And he was everything you want a writer to be if you don't know any writers. Funny, kind, erudite, so lots and lots of information. Yeah, come in. And, I had a couple of run-ins with him later, but that was just an absolutely flat-out wonderful afternoon. I don't know how I got off on that, but that was.
Go on. Yeah.
I still like doing journalism because it was such a nice change from doing comics.
I understand.
So I didn't refuse any of those kind of jobs. I didn't refuse the offer to write a book for Scholastic.
Did you hang on to those tapes? Or did you, after it was done?
No, God knows where they went. I have moved about 14 times since then. And one of the reasons I'm not moving out of this house, although I'm now living here alone, is there are so goddamn many books and tapes and videos and courses and thousands of comic books.
Sure, I bet.
It's going to be a nightmare for whoever gets stuck doing that after I cash in my chips, if that's how I cash in my chips.
I understand.
I've been dead once, and you
were
nothing to it.
You were dead once, you say?
Yeah, about 15 years ago, I was having lunch with Mia Wolf. Probably you don't know the name. She has a connection to comics. But we were, and her 12-year-old son, Virgil, were in a Mexican restaurant in a nearby town. And according to Mia, I was talking about I don't believe in an afterlife. And she said that you fell off the chair. And I thought you were trying to be funny.
Oh, my God.
So I didn't do anything. And after a couple of minutes, I looked over and you had turned green. So
Wow.
she yelled for help. The guy who owned the restaurant was also a fireman, so he knew where there was a defibrillator next door in City Hall. He got that on the third try. He got my heart beating. I was clinically dead for 5 to 10 minutes,
Wow.
I guess.
Jesus.
Nobody was keeping track. And by that time, the medics had arrived, and they had great toys for bringing me back to life. So they did, and I went to hospitals and then had open heart surgery about a week later.
Wow. You know, I do remember I remember when you were recovering from your heart surgery. Wow. Oh my. Denny,
Yeah, now all 4 of my brothers have had the same operation. It's obviously genetics.
Jeez, man. Well, you know, all these like near-death experiences that you've had. This is incredible. I'm glad you made it to the other, that you're able to walk away from them. I'm sure slowly, but I'm glad that, geez, I don't know what else to say. That's insane. And I'm sorry.
Well, I can say that on the plus side, I have not had a dull or boring life. And I'm really grateful for that. I'm really grateful for the last 15 years of being a comic book editor because, gee whiz, Mary Fran and I went to fucking Australia, for heaven's sake.
Fantastic.
I would never have even thought to go there. We got introduced to the president of Chile. We had lunch in the Senate dining room. It's been such an interesting life. BC, the Time Warner stayed out of my face except for that one story I told you where I had to bring Batman back to life prematurely.
Right.
But I worked with great people. I had the best toy you could give a storyteller. Batman is a great storytelling tool, and I could pretty much tell the stories I wanted to tell. It was a great gift to give to somebody whose primary mission in life has been telling stories. So yeah, it has been a tough life here and there, but I wouldn't change a second of it.
I understand.
Because wow,
yeah, what
a great! And toward the end, there was money attached. When I went to work in comics, I was making enough to cover expenses, rent and food. Toward the end, we had royalties. We had ancillary payments. It got to be a very good job as jobs go. It was hard sometimes. There were bad weeks, bad months. But that's true of any job. Sure. I didn't work anywhere near as hard as my father did running a grocery store.
Understood. My dad ran a restaurant. I totally understand, and I feel the same way. And no, and again, that's great and not surprising because again, your body of work has been beloved for all these decades. And again, what you put into Batman in particular, yeah, they're all following in your footsteps, Denny, and I say that because it's true. And also I'm interested when you came back and also after you got sober, am I right in the time frame? You wrote Venom, the original Legends of the Dark Knight story that introduced the drug that later became the basis for Bane.
Yeah.
But that story of Bruce Wayne really kind of finding this way to at least initially think, oh my God, this is an improvement. I can be a better Batman through the help of chemicals. Tell me about that story and how.
Well, I would not have written it if I hadn't had my own experience with alcoholism. But the genesis of the story was my waking up one day and realizing nobody ever takes the first drink thinking, well, I'm going to completely fuck up my life. I'm going to ruin my marriage. I'm going to lose my job. I'm going to end up in a gutter. Yeah, that's my agenda. I couldn't talk to girls. sober. I mean, alcohol allowed me to go to parties and ask girls for dates for a long time. It was a very useful social tool. Now, there comes the day when a corner is turned and suddenly it's not a tool anymore, it's something you have to have. Then you've got problems, and you never know. Annie, my wife, matched me drink for drink back then, but she didn't have to have it. When it was appropriate to stop drinking, she stopped. When it was appropriate to stop drinking, I continued until the bottle was empty.
Yeah.
So you never know ahead of time. Both sides of the family are riddled with bad alcoholics. I didn't know that. So one of the things I told my son early on was I did an 8th step with him. Where you're supposed to talk to the people who were harmed by your drinking and confess your sins to them. I figured the two people most harmed were Jeannie Thomas and Larry O'Neill, and I talked to both of them.
Wow.
And that's a good strategy. You face the demons. But the genesis of that story was exactly that. If I take this drug, whatever it is, I can be a better version of what I am. And it's true for a while, usually. Then comes the bad times.
No, it was an incredible story. It's really, I think, a very powerful one, and I love the evolution of this storytelling, and I wanted to know your opinion of this, if this was a conscious decision, because the prior decades to when you guys started being more socially aware, but also really getting into character, I really think obviously just elevated the whole comic book medium as far as the superhero genre goes, because now we were seeing the flaws in these characters. And, Dave Michelini did it with Iron Man, with Demon in a Bottle. Or
I owe Dave for that.
And that's, I mean, those kinds of moves. And certainly Venom is a great personal Bruce story where he had, I just think that's great, rather than smash through the wall, like my Superman trope. And don't get me wrong, it still works. But that classic, like, George Reeves moment, he crashes through the wall, the gangsters shoot at him, bullets bounce off, he clunks their heads, and he flies them off to jail, and that's the end of the story. Or the Batman equivalent. And it's like, no, you appreciate when they have doubts. Frank did it as well, Miller in Dark Knight Returns, and these characters become more three-dimensional. So was that one of your goals as you were writing comics, even going back to, those times in the 70s?
Well, here's the big advantage I had that my predecessors didn't. I went into it after Stan Lee created Marvel, and what he did to create Marvel, as much as anything, was to change the writing. Everybody was still in the shadow of Frederick Wertham, and comic book guys were afraid to even use slang. Stan pretty deliberately decided to ignore that stuff. He wrote witty, self-deprecating, self-satirical stories. I was, by that time, a Navy veteran, and I taught in ghetto schools, and I thought of myself as pretty sophisticated. But Stan's approach gave me permission. He's not taking it seriously, therefore I can read this because I won't take it seriously either. I think what I was really responding to was the stories. But my excuse was, well, he's got these witty captions that are making fun of the whole Marvel thing. So, yeah. So I had that going for me, that Stan had found a new way to approach the writing of comic book stories. And at about the same time, Julie Schwartz had reinvented the other half of it, the half that does with origin stories and plots. He called on his science fiction background. It served him well. And between the two of them, they reinvented superheroes within a year or so of each other. So I came in, as did Roy and Steve, without any need to pay a lot of attention to a lot of stupid rules that really didn't serve any purpose. And it was okay for me to do characters because Stan was doing characters. He had, opened the path. And it didn't occur to me not to write the stories as wittily as I could.
Well, that's good. I mean, again, it blew my little mind, as a 10-year-old something, and then into my tween years in the early 70s, and always really appreciated your writing, Cary Bates' writing, Marty Pasco, and
Cary was the great unsung hero. I mean, for 11 years, he found a new way to use super speed. That alone would put him in my pantheon.
Agreed. And I always loved his Superman stories too. I always felt he really had a great handle on telling great Superman stories, and Elliot Magan as well. And I know he's one of your disciples, and certainly followed your example with Green Arrow years after your guys' run. You guys were my original storytellers, and truly I followed your stuff very carefully and appreciated what you guys were doing, and felt like, again, I was reading important stories. When I read the 100-page spectaculars or 80-page giants, and they would have the reprints of the older stuff, I still appreciated those because I think I was young enough to still do it, and I'm glad I read those.
Well, yeah, they were what they were. It's been a long and fairly fast evolution from people who had done nothing but write pulp stories suddenly are doing comic books, and they don't. I think Jerry Schuster, Joe Siegel, and Bill Finger had a sense of what a comic book was, what this kind of narration was. But most of the guys were really making it up as they went along, and it wasn't supposed to be good because the bosses had no respect for, the work that was being done. They got real rich because of that work, but they didn't find any need to share any of that. Health insurance? No, you're fired.
Yeah. Jeez. How about Jeanette Kahn when she came over? Did you have many interactions?
Well, she was a breath of fresh air. She was her predecessor was a guy who was not, even though he would deny this now, was not a businessman, and he got the job as the big boss. I think because what became Time Warner bought the company, and they didn't know anything about it, but they had flow charts and that sort of thing. And on paper, he was the highest ranking member of the editorial department. So he kind of got the job, I think, that way. There's a lot of gossip that went around about the particulars of that. I'm not going to retail any of that because I have no reason to believe it's true.
Okay.
But he walked into his office one day and he was escorted out of the building by security guys. I have never found out why, but it was not just getting fired, because that happened fairly often, and it was not that unusual, but he was not allowed to take anything out of his office, as far as I know. I know for a certainty he was escorted onto the street by uniformed guys. And then here comes Jeanette Kahn, 23 years old. Rabbi's daughter had started 2 successful children's magazines already in her young life, and they gave her the job. And she learned on the job, but she was, the name of the company was National Periodicals Publications. Mm-hmm. And as Tom Wolfe once said about the New York Times Magazine, you think water buffaloes on the cover and those stories. and your weekly dose of boredom. And along comes Jeanette and says, we shouldn't hide the fact that we do comics. We should advertise it. So she had a jacket made for herself. At that time, Superman, the movie, was in the air. Jeanette's jacket said Superman, the comic book, on the back of it. And I think she made mistakes, as anybody would, coming into a totally alien job. But she made us happy with what we did. She tried to give us a sense of pride. She tried to bring this antiquated publishing venue into the 20th century. I think she was much more on the plus side than on the minus side. I think she now lives just a few blocks from my kid. My kid just moved to Harlem. And Jeanette has lived there about 10 years now.
That's awesome. I'm really glad. It seems like in the last couple of years, people are learning more about her story and that she is getting her due for changing things. And I'll tell you, man, again, that was in the midst of my reading, and you felt the creative energy. And I also read her original children's magazines, Dynamite, and I think Pizzazz was the other one.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, those were coming to us in grade school through Scholastic, and they were great. And it doesn't surprise me. It is amazing to learn that she was 23 and taking over DC Comics. Yeah. That's really incredible. My God.
Yeah. She has now got her name on movie credits. And I occasionally run into her, very rarely. It's always a very cordial, pleasant meeting.
That's cool.
She has aged, but haven't we all?
Sure. I understand. Absolutely. Well, again, this is, 40, really, I guess more than 40 years since she took over. Holy cow. Crazy. Yeah. And honestly, I appreciate your time. I wondered if you had any thoughts on, we lost a couple big, geek culture icons, and Steve Ditko, you mentioned him earlier, and I know Charlton was the kind of business that likely freelancers didn't necessarily run into each other, but I wondered if you had any Steve Ditko memories or encounters that you wanted to share.
Well, I did not offer to eulogize Steve, though I had great respect for him. I mean, I am occasionally called on to do that, and it's generally something I'm happy to do. But we just so disagreed on so many things.
Sure.
I feel guilty about Steve, and I'll tell you why. Twice I took over characters that he created and changed them drastically, changed them into things that he can't possibly have liked. Well, with the question, when Levitz asked me to do it, I said, I can't write I can't do the kind of story Steve is doing. And he said, do the kind of stories you feel like doing. Well, that was kind of a slap in the face to Steve, though I didn't realize it. And Lenny Ween eventually said, you were going to change it that much, why didn't you simply create your own character?
Interesting.
It's a good question.
Wow, interesting. Yeah.
The answer was that, I was used to doing assignments. This was something that the president of the company assigned to me. And so I did it, as I had been doing for 40 years. But Steve was one of those vehement Ayn Rand people. Yes. I came back from one of the marches on the Pentagon, and I happened to run into him in the office the next day, and he was talking about how those hippies should have been machine guns, and I'm thinking, whoa, I'd have been right in the line of fire.
Wow, yeah.
But that's a problem I have with conservatives of any kind. It's always about violence.
Understood, yeah.
On the other hand, the progressives and liberals don't seem to know what they're doing. So
I share your frustration and do understand. And frankly, we did talk about 12 years ago in our first conversation about how you changed the question. But you did put it in the book that he had his near-death experience and came out of it a changed man. And I can also, did you ever have an opportunity to see him after you started your run? And did you ever exchange words in you know, what you were doing with the character?
No, he was not a sociable man. He
Sure.
pretty much stuck to, well, my dominant emotion about him, I guess, is pity, because he seemed to be so lonely and so isolated. He had his little cramped studio on 8th Avenue, and I think he lived mostly in a hotel.
Wow.
And was vehement about the Ayn Rand stuff.
Yeah.
Mr. A,
Yes.
there is no gray. There's only black and
Yes.
white. Those people remind me of evangelical Christians. I'm right. There's no point in arguing this. I'm right, and you should die if you don't agree with me.
Wow. Yeah. Jeez. And how about Harlan Ellison? And another pointy man, but man, I loved his stories. And also, you know, as passionate as he was about his points of view, you could never, you know, he was never not entertaining, at the very least.
He was a miraculously good speaker. I once saw him hold an audience of 3,000 people from midnight till 3 a.m. while a projector got fixed at a convention. The movie to be shown was The Boy and His Dog. Yeah, I've wondered about Harlan. I saw him in Atlanta about 5 years ago, and he gave me the Julie Schwartz Lifetime Achievement Award. It was very kind of cool to get that from Carl. And I hadn't spoken to him for 10 years, and I didn't know what the problem was, if any, but he ran across the stage when they read out my name as the winner of this award, and told the audience, I haven't seen talked to Denny in 10 years. And I'm thinking, yeah, it's because you disappeared. But he hugged me, and the next day he went out of his way to make sure that I got the seat next to his on the panel about Julie that we did. And I guess we were pretty close friends at one point. When I needed work, he got it for me. Get out here in 48 hours, you can probably write a TV show. And I got out there in 48 hours and wrote the show.
Wow.
He's a man who I think is not inconsiderable talent as a writer was compromised by his great talent as a stand-up comedian. Because he could get instant gratification that way. Writing is a slow process, as I'm sure you know. And there's a part of you that has to want to close that door behind you for 20 to 30 hours a week. The last writing I know that Harlan did was in public, in a Fifth Avenue bookstore window.
Yes. Go on. Yes.
And he did something similar in Los Angeles. Well, that's okay. I really try hard not to be judgmental anymore. One of my great faults. But that's kind of showing off more than writing. And if you need that kind of stimulation, you have a problem you have to look at. Not pretend that's not there.
Very interesting. Yeah. Now,
so he until about age 35, he was super talent. Also a very good guy to get along with. He was a very good guy to hang out with. Very generous to me in that when I went out to write that CBS show, he had a secret room in his house that you got to by knowing which books on a bookshelf to move. And then it opened, and that was my bedroom for the time it took me to do that CBS
That's
job.
hilarious. A secret panel led to your bedroom at Harlan's house. I've heard about that secret panel in that room. That's amazing. Denny, I didn't know you wrote television, and can you tell us some of the shows you wrote for?
Well, that one was Logan's Run.
Oh,
It
yes.
never got broadcast because the show got canceled. I wrote episode 13.
Okay.
The show got canceled after about 10 episodes.
Yeah, I remember as a kid watching the television version of Logan's Run. Sure.
But I got suddenly had a summer-wide hole in my schedule. I had nothing to write. I had no work to do. So I called Harlan, and I just quoted him a little while ago. If you can get out here in 48 hours, it's not too late to get a job. So he left me his car, and one Sunday morning, or one weekday morning, I went to a movie studio, and I talked to the woman who had been the story editor on Star Trek, and the producer, and I walked out of there with an assignment. And all due to Harlan's generosity.
Wow. Was that D.C. Fontana? Okay. Yeah.
The backstory on that is that when I was kind of a hippie in St. Louis, I and two young women and a friend of mine who was in law school at the time rented a house and, went chipped in on the necessary things. And we were, if there was such a thing as a hippie in St. Louis at the time, we were probably it. And this guy named Mike Ayler passed through town. He was a wandering intellectual, and when we were talking about books with him, he said, "Well, listen, you want to know a writer, Harlan Ellison. He lays the truth on you so thick you can't stand it." And here's Mike Ayler talking about this guy we never heard of. So we got in my brother's car, and we went to the airport because I knew their bookstore would be open, and Harlan had a book out, and we all got it. So I knew who he was before I got to New York.
Interesting.
And one of the first parties we went to, Annie, my wife, was and I guess is quite beautiful. And so we were at a party, and Harlan hit on her, and she said, "No, I'm married." And he said, "Well, that's all right. Let's get out of here." And she said, "No, my Denny O'Neill is my husband." Well, I had exchanged letters with Harlan at that point. He said, "Oh, okay. Well, introduce me to Denny." And, we kind of stayed in touch after that.
That's amazing. That's fantastic. Jesus. Too much, man.
I worry about him a little bit because I haven't heard anything about him for about 5 years. And Harlan was a guy that if he was in town, you knew it.
I understand. Yeah.
The young woman I'm having a phone conversation with tomorrow I was gonna meet Harlan for dinner, and a bunch of other people were coming, and I was hanging around with Carol. So I said, "Why don't you come to dinner?" So New York City was in the middle of a blizzard, and I was an hour late getting to the apartment that Harlan was in. So for that hour, Harlan had nothing to do at all but let Carol have both barrels of the charm. By the time I got her, this educated, intellectual, funny woman was totally in his pocket.
I understand, man. No, and as you say, quite a storyteller and quite a charmer all the way. And I loved when he was on the Sci-Fi Channel doing his little commentaries about what was going on in everything. I mean, I remember him commenting on when Marvel was near bankruptcy, and he was really just devastated by it, and we're not going to. Marvel might end up, who knows? DC might end up getting these characters, and his speculation of what might happen at that point in the late '90s. It was always interesting to hear his point of view.
Yeah, comic books were a gift to him, I think, because it gave him a venue. I don't know why he didn't stick closer to science fiction, because they loved him too, but he became part of the comic book world, and for years DC sent him, as they did me, everything they published. They stopped doing that a couple of years ago.
Yes.
But his house was amazing. If you could just get an hour in Ellison's joint. There was a lot of corners, and around every corner was something you didn't expect to see.
That's amazing. That's great.
A poster or a movie prop or something. And he had, of course, thousands of books and a very extensive comic book collection and a secret panel.
Absolutely, man. Too much. Last time we spoke, you said you were working on a current Batman project. And by the way, if this is something you don't want to tease, we can. I'll stop and we can edit this. But I was curious, and I assume they're going to release it next year for the 80th anniversary of Batman.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff coming up. The 1000th issue of Detective, and Batman shortly thereafter. Yeah, no, I don't mind talking about what I did. I wrote a sequel to There Is No Open Crime Alley, but because the business has loosened up a lot, I got a chance to really write the story you might want to write. Batman is a jerk in this, and without Leslie, he would have done something he could never have forgiven himself for. All in the cause of violence on the side of righteousness. So the kid who edited it said the little speech I gave Leslie about you think you're fighting, you're working against violence, you're actually promoting it because you can't solve a problem without hurting someone. Those are things I might have put in the first story, and I didn't think I'd get away with them then. But I did now. I'm very happy with them. It's probably happier with that and the Christmas story than any comic book work I've done in years. We should also say something about my poor forlorn novel.
Yes, of course.
It's out there, I'm told. I have not as yet signed an autograph, but I have not ventured very far from this house. I'm debating whether or not to give a copy to Carol tomorrow. I don't give away my stuff, but there were two kids who came to the front door, and they knew my address, and they just called to say hello to me because they were comics fans. Just out of nowhere. Yeah, so I gave them a copy of. So we should say that this is a novel that is about 30% autobiographical and is largely about comic books changed from a backwater, disreputable trash genre to something that is taught in most of the major universities in the country. And you can get it from Amazon. Of course, you can get anything from Amazon. But I didn't take any ads out, and everybody told me, including Chuck Dixon, who's had a lot of success doing Amazon publishing, that you have to promote it.
Well, it's called the Perils of Captain Mighty and the Redemption of Danny the Kid. I've got it on my tablet. You and Larry were kind to send me the PDF of it, and no, it's great, Denny. And again, we spoke about it a few months ago, but I'm glad to mention it again, and also the fact that, as you say, you're going to have a handful of copies when you go to Terrificon next month in Connecticut. So a few people will be able to get it there, but it's on Amazon, and you can pick it up as well digitally. And yeah, it's an incredible story, and it's a very personal story, and I am, again, as you said earlier, It maybe went in a direction you weren't planning on going into, but I think it only makes you a much more interesting person to learn a lot of your backstory in this book.
Well, thank you, John. That's very nice of you. I should go relate to the nice lady who's here to make sure I don't fall over and die.
I will let you go, and yes.
So I will talk to you again.
Truly, I appreciate it, Danny, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you next month. And I will let you and Larry know when I put this out. But thank you very much for your time. I really, really appreciate it.
You bet.
And that's where we left it. I was able to see Denny at that summer's Terrificon. He was on a fantastic panel with Mike Barr, Pt2, Jim Starlin, and Tim Seeley, all talking about Robin. And it was, for some of them, the most cathartic opportunity to talk about, I never really liked Robin. Yeah, neither did I. Hell, I killed Robin. And then you had Pete and Tim Seeley kind of holding the Nightwing Robin bag of, well, we like Dick Grayson. What's the problem? And it isn't Dick. It's the idea of a 10-year-old kid, or however old you wanted to make Robin when he was just starting out, with this guy with gunfire in alleys and things like that. And one guy is dressed in in black and blue and can hide in the shadows, and the other guy's in red, green, yellow. Man, I think, God, Two-Face used to call Robin the boy hostage. This is Target the boy wonder. I don't know. Anyway, I just wanted to point all that out, and some other things you can look for in the Word Balloon feed. More great stuff from Denny O'Neil over the years, even our first conversation back in 2006. I'm going to have a fun week this week on Word Balloon. The return of Scene Missing on Tuesday. Ian and Gabriel and I will be talking about the film Convoy. The CB craze reaches its apex with the C.W. McCall song and the Chris Christopherson movie directed by Sam Peckinpah. I didn't even remember that. Holy shit. One of the greats of the 60s and 70s directs this movie. Did we need it? I don't know. We'll get into the discussion with Ian and Gabe. That's happening Tuesday night. Monday night, I'm going to talk to Brian Azzarello, catch up with him about his new distillery book that he's doing with Eduardo Riso, and a whole lot more. So join us on Word Balloon Live this week. That's what's planned so far. Things are in motion, and I'll tell you more as those plans develop. But thanks a lot for listening. Until next time, Word Balloon is a copyright feature of Shaky Productions. Copyright 2024.